What's going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So today I'm bringing to you my June 2019 competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Tier list. Now, I want to take all the decks that we've started seeing in these top cut breakdowns and kind of assemble them into a tier list so that way we can visualize what decks you should expect to see the most represented, what decks you should expect to see at the top, so on and so forth. And if you guys like these types of videos, let me know because we can start doing these a lot more often. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So I'm on Tier Maker here. This is at the bottom all the decks that I figure you're going to see potentially at your nationals or your WCQs just based off of previous results and different things like that, or at least the ones I thought warranted at least even a little bit of discussion. So kicking things off, we have Invoked. Specifically, we're going to be talking about Mech Knight Invoked here. Mech Knight Invoked was a strategy that actually saw a pretty significant showing at the UK National, I believe making it either to the top 32 or the top 16. And what was so interesting was the fact that we saw this deck actually easily break apart a Pendulum board, and that's pretty impressive. I mean, it's a pretty good deck for what it's worth, but I don't exactly think that it's worthy of something you should be considering playing if you're wanting to go the distance. I think one of the biggest flaws of this deck particularly is Alistair the Invoker, simply because of the fact there are so many hand traps that can potentially stop him, especially because there are so many hand traps being played in the main format that I want to put this like in the rogue category, but like I don't even really think it deserves to go there. It's something that I feel like you might see, which is going to be in the everything else category, but I don't think it's like warranted enough to actually make it to that rogue status, just because it's got too many weaknesses in this current format, in my opinion anyway, to really go the distance. Now, Altergeist is another deck that's kind of interesting. So, Altergeist was a deck that saw like virtually no play for the last few months, and then all of a sudden out of nowhere, it managed to win the German National. And now, not only did it manage to do that, it wasn't just like one and done, it's managed to get several top slots at like all these huge events that have taken place over the last weekend. I mean, like the Oceanics, I mean, we saw at the Australian National, we saw at the French National, like it was in there in some form or another, sometimes actually up there with like the tier 1 contenders. So maybe there's something to Altergeist here because of the fact that it can kind of play with the other control decks of the format, but also play enough hand traps and enough tools to combat the combo decks. I'm actually going to go ahead and put Altergeist in the tier 2 category at the moment. It's actually rather impressed me. I was going to put it in rogue, but I feel pretty confident putting it at tier 2, and I think it's definitely something you need to start considering when you're in your deck building process, or a deck you might start to see a lot more of at these high tier competitive events for this season. Next up is Cyber Dragon. Cyber Dragon is a deck that, again, it's really neat. I don't really think it's anything like too insane, but it has a really lot of good things going for it. Being able to blind seconds, you can play tons of really good cards like Evenly Match, different things like that. It has a really good ability to just remove cards out of the extra monster zone, so you can get rid of like Ray against Sky Striker, and you can get rid of like Salamander cards, different things like that. Then again, though, it does have a lot of weaknesses as well in this particular format, so I'm putting Cyber Dragon in the rogue tier. You definitely might see it, but don't exactly expect to see it like all over the place. But you could potentially play one in your Swiss rounds of any event. Next up is Burning Abyss. Burning Abyss, remember last Nationals and WCQ season that Burning Abyss had this massive resurgence? I don't exactly think we're going to be seeing that this time around. It's kind of cute. You can do some stuff with like Orcas combos and different things like that, but I don't exactly think it has a very good place. I think it's too hard for it to deal with Danger Thunder Dragon in particular, and all these other different types of decks that can pretty much make these huge, massive, unbreakable boards. I think that was kind of one of the weaknesses against like Goki last year's format, so I'm going to put it in the everything else category. I wouldn't be surprised if someone's crazy enough to try this deck, but again, I wouldn't really think too much into it. Guru Control is another deck that is, again, it's seen its fair share of play, but I don't really think it's anything too spectacular. I'm going to go ahead and put it in the rogue category. It's got some pretty interesting dynamics, especially in this current meta, but I don't exactly think that it's going to go the distance. But again, you might expect to see one in your Swiss rounds. You might even see one in the day 2, because for some reason, Guru Control just manages to make day 2 more often than some of these other decks do. So that's why I value it a little bit higher than something like the Mech Knight Invoked or like Burning Abyss. Now, True Draco is an interesting one. Previously, I had True Draco kind of like in this tier 2 category because it's always managed to get a top cut slot, and it's actually managed to fare rather well against some of the top tier strategies. But as of late, I'm actually leaning towards putting it in the rogue tier just because of the fact that people stopped playing Mystic Mine. People are main decking spell and trap removal, and that really hurts this deck because of the floodgates and all the other types of interactions there. The deck is pretty decent for what it's worth, and honestly, it's probably like in the top 5 budget decks of like, not even just this format, but like for probably the foreseeable future until they hit some of the consistency cards. But I think this is a deck that you should expect to see, but don't expect to play a lot of them. Alright, now Orcas is without a doubt just going to go straight to the tier 1 category. This deck has just proven itself with how many tops it's managed to garner in these past few events. It's managed to win like probably more regionals than like any other deck at the moment, and it's just tearing things up right now. This deck's combo ability is crazy. It has such cool interactions. Dingirsu is such an abusable card, and honestly, it just does so many unfair things that these other decks really can't do that I confidently can put this in the tier 1 slot. Now, Pendulum's an interesting one. I'm actually going to go and stick Pendulum here in tier 2. Now, notice how I have Electromite representing Pendulum. I'm kind of covering all the Pendulum decks here, so this counts Endymion, Zephyra, and just pure Pendulum Magician in general, because I kind of just mold them all together, even though the decks are slightly different depending on what engines you play. Pendulum is actually a very good deck. I think Pendulum is probably the best tier 2 deck out of the entire format. We've seen it's able to compete with the top decks. It is able to just assemble massive boards. It has pendulum summoning mechanics just to completely break the game in its own way, and just the fact that it's a really good combo deck, I think solidifies it in that tier 2 position. It managed to garner a lot of tops over the past weekend, and you should expect to see Pendulum, especially more so than all these other decks, and just be wary of that because this deck is absolutely terrifying if it starts to go off. Now, Mystic Mine Burn is a deck we haven't talked about in quite some time. Mystic Mine kind of fell out of favor. I mean, it was really popular, but now it's really not seeing too much play. I'm going to go ahead and put this in the everything else category, although I want you to be mindful that people are still playing Mystic Mine in different decks like Sky Striker, Orcas, and different things like that, just as a way to slow the game down. But I think Mystic Mine Burn itself is kind of phased out for the most part. I know it's still like topping here and there at like regionals, but I think at like really high tier events, people are just too prepared for the deck now in the side deck with spell and trap removal for it to really do much of anything. Next up is Salamander, easily tier 1. Salamander is arguably the best deck of the format just because of the fact that it has been winning event after event. It is so consistent. The fact that you can play a plethora of hand traps to back its single card engine, it's able to do the same thing turn after turn after turn, and you're going to see that across the span of a single event. And the thing is, yeah, it doesn't put up the most intimidating boards, but the fact that it can do the same thing consistently, it doesn't really lose too hard to hand traps because since it plays so many of its own, it's able to counteract and interact with the opponent during their turn, and it has access to kind of just any tool for any situation. It's a very jack of all trades deck, and I think that's why it's seeing so much success, not to mention the accessibility for the price point is actually pretty decent. Yeah, if you're wanting to play it like super high tiers of competitive play, it's going to cost you more, but at the same time, it's just a very good deck whether you're playing at a budget level or at the highest tier, and I think for the most part, Salamander is probably, at least in my view, the #1 deck of the format and the deck to beat going into the WCQs and Nationals. The numbers don't lie, and we've seen, you know, like from my meta analysis, for instance, that Salamander is taking up the highest representation at nearly all of these events. Next up is Sky Striker. Sky Striker just has to go into tier 1. Sky Striker is, again, just proven its worth. Even with Kagari going to 1, the deck is still utterly resilient. It's got tons of consistency. You know, if you just see a copy of Engage, you're most likely going to win that game. And the fact that you still have multi-roll at 3 copies is absolutely absurd. Sky Striker is interesting because it's based solely on spell cards, and with stuff like Orcas having a ton of monster negates, and like Widow Anchor can just play around different cards, not to mention Sky Striker can play like Mystic Mine, which means it can slow the other combo heavy decks down to their level, and Sky Striker is arguably the best control deck in the format, and when you get to play the Sky Striker game with Sky Striker, you're automatically going to win. It's very slow at dealing damage, but you're not really playing that game. You're focusing on controlling the board and dwindling your opponent out of resources. Very strong deck, probably one of the strongest decks of the entire year, and definitively a tier 1 contender. Next up is Spiral. Spiral actually managed to like top 8 at the, I think, French National. I think I'll be getting you that deck profile very soon here. I'm gonna go ahead and put Spiral in the everything else category. It's another combo-based deck, kind of similar to like Orcas or like Pendulum. We're able to assemble this massive board, and then if you go second, you actually have some pretty decent tools for breaking an opponent's board. However, I think it's just like an inferior version of the two decks. It does things a little bit differently, but at the same time, I just think it's too susceptible to double helix resolving, whereas like Orcas has like backup plans if Mermaid gets hit. Spiral doesn't really have that, and with so many of the this control decks as well as the other decks just playing tons of hand traps to combat the large combo decks of the format, I just want to put Spiral down at the bottom. I still think you could maybe see one of it like in your Swiss rounds, but I wouldn't expect to see too many of it, but definitely know that people are experimenting with it, and the Spirals definitely give the deck a lot of versatility. Next up is Thunder Dragon, Danger Thunder Dragon, Guard Dragon specifically, and that's, again, tier 1. I mean, this deck has just had a massive resurgence. It's basically back, and the fact that you have now the Crusadia engine to back this deck up, adding another layer of consistency, and just being able to just go through with your combos, not caring about what hand traps your opponent has, because you can just make some utterly crazy boards. Thunder Dragon is arguably the best combo deck of the format, because it plays just like 37 extenders and like 3 copies of Denko Sekko, which is just absolutely nuts. And this is a deck you definitely have to worry about, because it's really hard to like build a deck for like all 4 of these top tier 1 contenders, but it is something that you're going to have to figure out how to solve going into any large tournament. Next up is Paleozoic. Now, Paleozoic is interesting because not a lot of people have been talking about this deck at all, but what's interesting is that in Japan, and I know they have a different format, Paleozoic actually did very well at a recent couple of tournaments, at large tournaments at that, in a format that's very similar to ours. So I actually am going to put Paleozoic in this rogue category here, because this is a little bit of my wild card pick, but I wouldn't be surprised if someone finds a way to kind of build Paleozoic for our specific format. I know we don't have Max C, which could definitely have a big influence, but Paleozoic has some very interesting things, very similar to Altergeist, for why it has those similar strengths, and having access to like Totally Awesome and stuff can make a huge difference. So I don't know, I think if Altergeist can start to do well, maybe Paleozoic has a place. So just, you know, have that on your radar, but don't exactly, you know, worry too much about it. But who knows, we might be surprised at the later WCQs. Trickstar I'm going to go ahead and put in the rogue category. This is another deck that can play a ton of hand traps, but it can also dish out a ton of damage. It's kind of similar to like Mech Knight Invoked, except it doesn't lose as hard, and I think just Light Stage being one of the best cards of the format, you see it being played in Orcas and other decks as well. I think just having it natively gives you an advantage against these other control decks like your Salamander and Striker matchup. So I definitely think that Trickstar is a deck to worry about, but again, I don't think you should expect to see too many of them, but don't be surprised if someone just tries to play Trickstar with like a million hand traps and they end up making it day 2. Last but not least is Dinosaur. I'm going to put Dinosaur in Rogue. Dinosaur's got some really neat tools in like Lost World, being able to lock out Sky Striker like entirely, not to mention its boss monsters are crazy. Double Evolution Pill is like an absurd card. It just has like bomb after bomb after bomb, and it just has a lot of really good just weapons at its disposal. I don't really think too highly of it, but then again, I definitely think that you could see a Dinosaur deck very well enter day 2, even though we haven't seen one do that yet. I think that there's still the potential to see that happen. So guys, that's going to go ahead and wrap up my June 2019 tier list. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about this, and if you think anything else should be positioned differently, I'd really love to hear your thoughts and feedback. So guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video helpful, consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a YouTube channel member, because just by showing your support in any way that you can, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.